You'll remember before Thanksgiving that I asked you to answer the 3 questions at the top of the screen. At the bottom of the screen, you will see my answers. Now, your answer might look different because you might have named a different coordinate pair, but you should have noted that the first number in the coordinate pair is the x-coordinate, and the second number is the y-coordinate. I then ask you to name any point on the y-axis. So your answer should be a coordinate pair that has an x-coordinate of 0. Now, your y-coordinate could be any number. Why does the x-coordinate have to be 0? Because if you're on the y-axis, you're not to the right and you're not to the left, so the x-coordinate has to be 0. If I ask you to name any point on the x-axis, then you could have any value for the x-coordinate, but the y-coordinate has to be 0, because if you're on the x-axis, you're not up and you're not down, so the y-coordinate has to be 0. Most lines are slanted lines, or some of you have used the word diagonal. Most lines look like the ones you see here on the screen. Note here that there's a pattern to the inputs, and if there's a pattern to the inputs, there's a pattern to the outputs. For example, on the y's, notice here that the y's are going up by 2. On the example here on the right, notice that the y's are going down by 3. That's most lines. But we have some special lines. We have some special lines that we call y lines. Notice that there's not an x variable in this line, whereas if we look back at most lines, notice that there's an x and a y variable. But there's not an x variable here. Well, there really is. It's just that the coefficient of the x variable was 0, and 0 times x is 0, so it just dropped out. But we call this special line a y line. Now, we can choose, for our x's, we can choose any number we want, but notice that if you multiply x by 0, you're going to get 0, so the y values are all going to be the same. That's a pattern, and that's the pattern where y has to be -3. Notice that if we graph this on a coordinate plane, if we graph these 3 points, they line up and they form a horizontal line. So I want you to know that a y line is a horizontal line. Now you can remember that because the y-axis is vertical, it's up and down. But a y line is just the opposite, it's horizontal. So if your y coordinate stays the same, it forms a horizontal line. Now on an x line, you say, well, there's no y variable there. Well, there really is. It's just that the coefficient of the y is 0, so the y term drops out. Here, our inputs are not independent because this says x has to be -3. But our y's can be independent because y can be anything, because when you multiply it by 0, you still get -3. Now, if we were to graph those 3 points, we would get a vertical line. So what I want you to know is that an x line is always going to be a vertical line. You can remember that because the x-axis is horizontal, so an x line is just the opposite. So if the x-axis goes back and forth, an x line goes up and down. So I want you to remember that an x line is a vertical line, so that's a special line. So if I ask you to write the equation of the line that passes through each pair of points, notice in number 1 and number 2, notice in number 1 that the y values are exactly the same. Well, this must be a y line. I see a pattern. So the equation of the line must be y equals 5. I know it's a horizontal line. On number 2, notice the x values are the same. So this must be the line x equals 4, and it must be a vertical line. But notice on this third point, the x's are not alike, and the y's are not alike. So this is what we call just any old line. So I don't know what the equation is. I know it's y equals something times x plus or minus something, but I don't know how to fill in the boxes here without doing some further work. All right, in class I ask you to recognize which of these lines would be slanted, which would be horizontal, and which would be vertical. So you should have looked at number 1 and said, well, I can divide both sides by 5. So this is really the equation y equals 2. So this is a y line, which means it's a horizontal line. So number 1 is horizontal. Number 2 has both an x and a y, so I know it's a slanted line. It's either slanted up to the right or it's slanted up to the left, and we can determine that if we wanted to, but we're not going to do that at this point. Here in number 3, let's isolate the x. Let's add 3 to both sides. So this equation is really x equals 7, so it's an x line. Therefore, I know it's a vertical line. Now I can see right away that number 4 is a y line, so it's a horizontal line. And let me go back up here and put horizontal on number 1. Okay. Notice that number 5 has both an x and a y, so I know that it's a slanted line, either slanted up to the right or slanted up to the left. So I want you to be able to recognize the special lines, the y line, which is a horizontal line, and the x line, which is a vertical line.